Welcome to the Fave podcast. This is episode number 26, in which I interview friends, family members, colleagues, and talk about their background. We talk about the Fave topics, and we share a couple of stories. So today, my guest is Lee Romero. Lee is a knowledge management colleague of mine. We go back to 2008, I believe, when we first met, and we've been friends ever since. Lee, welcome to the Fave podcast.
All right, thanks, Dan.
I believe it was Lauren Klein who first told me about you. I was at a session being held at Michigan State University, probably in 2008, and we sat next to each other, and she mentioned that if I had a local knowledge management community going in Detroit, that I ought to find Lee Romero because he would be good to add to that. So I tracked you down. You came to a meeting of the local KM community, and then shortly thereafter, or maybe even at that meeting, I mentioned that we're looking for people to hire at Deloitte. I had just joined Deloitte, and you came after me. So we then formed the two-man KM team in the Detroit office, and they didn't require us to move to some other city. So that was good. We had critical mass when you came on board.
Yes, I was actually glad that you established the beachhead of Detroit because I know even when I was talking with Deloitte, they were talking about one of the four central cities that they wanted me to move to, and I was appreciative that you had established the precedent so that it didn't require that. So still in the Detroit area though.
You know, what's interesting about that is you and I would commute to the Deloitte office in the RenCen downtown Detroit and would sit in our cubes, and then we would actually talk to each other during the day. And later we found out that someone was complaining, I think, that there was too much noise. I thought, what's the point of us going to the office if we can't talk to one another? We may as well not even be there, right? Which is what eventually happened. We ended up both eventually working from home.
Yes, indeed. Be quiet. You're making too much noise, right?
Right. So let's start with your background. When and where were you born?
I was born in Marshall, Michigan, small little town. If anybody knows of Battle Creek, which most people know about and associate with the Kellogg food company, it's right near Battle Creek. I lived and grew up in a small, um, even small, I'd say a village just outside of Marshall called Eckford, Michigan. And when I was about 5 years old, we moved into the big city of Marshall, which was, I think, about 6,000 people at the time, and moved from a one-room schoolhouse where I started my kindergarten school year and started in a full, I think it was kindergarten through fourth grade elementary school, which was kind of a big change for me. Very large and kind of intimidating, I remember. Um, and then I lived in Marshall up until I went away to college. My ancestry, I guess for what it's worth, mostly is my mother, her family came from directly from England, although they came over to the US. I think it was sometime in like the 1600s, and they started out in New York, or northern New York State and sort of migrated west into the northern parts of Michigan, and that's where my mother grew up. Also includes a bit of other Nordic genetics in the background. I know I did an ancestry.com test about 5 years ago and learned a bit about my genetic background. So that's the primary influence I have. My family, my father was born in Mexico, or no, actually, I think he was born here in the States, but his parents were from Mexico. Um, and I don't really know about a whole lot about that side of the family at all. My mother and father were divorced when I was about one. Born in the mid 60s, actually, is also to just answer that question, born in the mid 60s, right on the cusp. I think I was the first year, 65, that's the first year considered Generation X as opposed to being a baby boomer. So I'm Gen X, I suppose, for whatever that's worth.
Okay, so that means that you're about 60, right?
I will be 60 in 10 days.
10
In
days.
fact, I was reminded of that this year's Spotify Unwrapped included a new feature where Spotify tells you how old you are based on your music listening behavior, and it pegged me exactly at 60, and I was immediately insulted because it was like 3 weeks before I actually turned 60.
How does it feel to be almost 60?
Kind of freaky, honestly, because I know that starts people thinking about retirement. I actually have friends who have already retired that are about the same age as I am. They worked in um, fields that are more amenable to early retirement, but just the whole thought of retirement still sort of my head is really not even close to that idea at this point. I feel like I still have a lot of interest in doing what I'm doing, a lot to contribute, hopefully. So I don't have any intent to retire too soon, but that's the thing that kind of weighs on me most about the creeping up on 60.
Okay.
That's for sure.
So after you left Marshall, where have you lived since then?
So I can also answer a few other questions here. I know that you've got. So I left Marshall, graduated in '84. Um, Ended up going to the University of Michigan. So I lived in Ann Arbor for about 6 years because I did my both an undergraduate degree and then a 2-year master's degree there at the University of Michigan. When I was trying to figure out what school to go to, I actually considered a few. Another one was Michigan Technological University. At the time, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do in school. I knew it was something in the math or science area, so that's the kind of attraction for those two schools. But as I kind of researched into Michigan Tech a bit more, I realized a couple of things. One was that, actually, I guess the first one was that it was like a 10-hour drive from where I lived, and you never left the state of Michigan. The other was that it is right on Lake Superior in the Upper Peninsula. And at the time, I remember reading that that area would get about 25 feet of snow every year. And I thought, that doesn't seem like a whole lot of fun. And then the third strike was that because it is an engineering school, and this was like in the mid 80s, the population skewed to like 6 to 1 for male to female. And that combination did not seem appealing to me. So ended up going to Michigan, which was only about an hour drive from my hometown. And got a degree there in computer science. When I started my career there, I really wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. Um, my freshman year, I took an astronomy class, and for a while I thought, hey, maybe I'd like to be an astronomer. But as I finished that class up and kind of looked into that, I realized that it was a very small field in terms of employment opportunities. My kind of dumb little joke about that is I read that there were like 12 job openings a year in the US, which did not seem like, and I think that's probably very hyperbolic, but it did not seem very conducive to finding gainful employment. So I took a class actually, I learned to write computer programs when I was in high school. I taught myself on a friend's TI 99 4A computer, which was an early personal computer. Taught myself to program in BASIC on it. And when I was in college, took a course in computer programming and just really enjoyed it and ended up majoring in computer science. And then my graduate years, I was in the computer science and engineering program, but focused a lot on AI, which in hindsight is kind of funny. I'm back working in that. I'll talk about that in a bit, but um, it was a very different AI, much more symbolic and much more in um, the vein of expert systems than you see today, where the AI approach is essentially generate a gigantic mountain of data and look for correlations in it that help you answer questions. It's kind of like a very simplistic view of things. But so I lived there in Ann Arbor for several years. Then I lived in Farmington Hills for a year when I got married. And then after that, moved out to Massachusetts and lived in Massachusetts for about 6 years. At that point, my wife was pregnant with our second child, and we were living in a location that was going to get sold out from underneath us. And with the other options on the table, we decided, and also with the fact that we wanted to be back closer to family, we decided to move back here to Michigan. And oddly and coincidentally, ended up back in Farmington Hills and have been there since. And so, pretty simple story.
Who was in your family when you were growing up?
So I grew up in a family where my mother, I lived with my mother and my sister, and there's just the two of us siblings. And we lived with a family that was another mother, and she had three children, and that was like up until about eighth grade, I think. That was my family. So I still think of the three children in that other family, Bonnie, Larry, and Beverly, as sort of pseudo siblings of mine, especially Bonnie. And my sister is down in Texas now. Bonnie's down in Florida. Um, and that was it. So pretty small. When I was in eighth or ninth grade, we ended up, my mother and I, my sister had moved out at this point. or was on the verge of moving out because she's a few years older than I am, and as she left high school, she joined the Army. So my mother and I ended up moving out, and we lived on our own through my high school years, just the two of us.
How did that arrangement with the other family come about?
Honestly, I don't know. I think it was a matter of economic convenience to
Hmm.
largely. My mother did, I think I mentioned earlier, my mother got divorced when I was about one. And the other mother was a widow, and I never really talked with my mother greatly about it, but I just felt like it was a case where it was just economically helpful to have fewer people or more people in the same house, um, kind of in that arrangement. So.
Yeah. What did your mother do?
When I was young, she was a stay-at-home mom. When I was in middle school, I think it was, she got a job. Actually, I think she her first few jobs, she worked as a secretary, but then she actually got a job at the local police department working as a dispatcher, and she did that for many years. And then she then went back to doing secretarial work at a few other companies before she retired. So a lot of work. I always think of my mom mostly, first and foremost, as a police dispatcher.
When you were young, what did you like to do?
When I was young, so let's see here. Like to play with toys, of course. And when I grew up in the 70s, there were no electronics, so I was drawn always to things like action figure type stuff. Um, I enjoyed board games at the time. Not as much as I do now. I'm very much into board games. I can talk about that a bit later on if you wish. And in high school, um, I got into track and field, and that was really my athletic interest at the time. And I was not permitted to play. Actually, I played baseball for a few seasons, but I was not particularly good at it, so that did not last long. I was never permitted to play football, so I never got into football at all. I don't have the hand-eye coordination for basketball, so I always thought of track as my sport purely because it's at least if you're just running, it requires the least coordination. You just have to be able to put one foot in front of the other, and that's kind of it. And in high school, I also eventually became the manager of the cross country team. I had hoped to run in the cross country team. When I started in track and field, I was a sprinter. I took up high hurdling because the team needed it. I was never really very good at it, but good enough. I did get a varsity letter my sophomore, junior, and senior years. But that was really because there was a lack of other people on the team willing to do the, the high hurdles more than anything. But I've always enjoyed running and had hoped to take part in the cross country team my junior or senior year, and just did not have the time in the summers um, to put in the training that I felt was necessary to kind of get ready in advance of the season. So I ended up taking up a managerial role, which was kind of I was the first person because the team is so small. It's not really necessary. I felt like the coach was kind of actually being a little bit just nice to say basically, yeah, sure, come hang out with us, but not much to do.
When you were young, what did you want to be when you grew up?
The very first thing I ever wanted to be was a paleontologist. I was the classic, I guess, little kid that just was very drawn to dinosaurs. I have very strong recollections of going to the library, going to the kids section. Actually, for a long time, I would check out books about insects, but I remember at one point looking through some book that had some quite realistic artistic renderings, and I was just like, well, this is gross. And I sort of my interest in insects at that point dried up, but my interest in dinosaurs never disappeared. I still find them fascinating, but definitely the first thing I wanted to be ever was a paleontologist. Um, as I mentioned, as I got into college, actually my high school years even, like I mentioned, I was always drawn to science and math, and I actually have had pretty decent talent in the mathematical area, and so doing something mathematical was always interesting, which is part of what drew me to the idea of astronomy, because so much of astronomy is just math. And same thing with computer science, although there's not quite as much math there. But it's like you're constantly solving puzzles. So I've always found that an interesting aspect of computer programming.
What was your first full-time job?
First full-time job out of school, I worked for a small consulting company named Synetics, and I was hired This was right out of right after finishing my master's. Got a job working in the artificial intelligence division of Synetics, which was like 4 or 5 people that were based here in West Bloomfield, Michigan. And this was when I was still in Ann Arbor. So I did that for a few years. And it was working with that company that actually took me to Massachusetts eventually. They were willing to help me move out there, which happened to be where their headquarters were. And I worked at their headquarters for another 5 years after that move. But doing a lot of custom software system development for a lot of different government contracts organizations. The first big one that I did was for the Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard. I also did another big system development project for Elections Canada, which is the federal agency in Canada that runs their federal elections. So those were kind of the two big projects I did while I was at that company, both of which I felt were very rewarding projects because they both had socially positive purposes. With the Coast Guard project, it was on a system that was, I don't even know if they use it anymore. It was called AMVER, which was something like the Automated Maritime Vessel Rescue System, which has a history that goes back, I think, to the 40s or 50s. And the whole system is predicated on the idea that ocean-going vessels would share their planned route and position on a recurring basis with the Coast Guard. Um, with the idea being that then the Coast Guard could keep track of where these ships were in the event that a ship in the middle of an ocean had a problem, they would know what was the ship, what ships were nearby and going, importantly, going in the right direction because with those giant ocean-going vessels, it is a very slow and time-consuming, probably expensive proposition to turn them in the water. So the whole idea behind Amber was make sure that they know where ships are in case somebody needs help and they can send it pretty quickly. And what we were doing is rebuilding an earlier version. And what I specifically was focused on in the first year or so was the problem that because this was all voluntary and originally the information sent from the ships would be passed through all sorts of things. Like they might send a telegraph literally or some other things. There was supposedly a format that they were supposed to use in the message that included specific fields and but because it was voluntary, the ships were um, just never followed the format. And so they at the time that it was originally implemented, they felt that an AI based system based on a really old architecture. For your listeners, if anybody has ever heard of a blackboard, that was the original basis of the system. So I had to rewrite that whole thing because what they found is that it just had a lot of weak spots the way it was originally written. But there were a lot of other things in that whole Amber system that I also eventually got involved in that had to do with the Coast Guard personnel who had to take the data that was pulled out of those messages and validate it and confirm that it was correct. And then also just whenever they would have a problem, of course, there had to be somebody who would look at the data and look at the ocean, the positions of ships and figure out who can help and how to get the message to them. So that was a kind of a cool project. The project for Elections Canada was also interesting because it was based on the idea. So in Canada, you do not have to register to vote, or at least this was current as of the mid to late 90s. You didn't have to register to vote. It was the responsibility of the government to make sure that you could vote. And the implication behind that was whenever they called for a federal election, they had to build out a list of electors, but the only way they could do that is to send people door to door and basically say, who are you? Are you planning to vote? And they would build out this big list of electors, but that took like 100,000 people was always the term. That was always the claim that I heard. So it was a pretty expensive proposition. So what they were looking for is a system that could take lists from other government agencies and merge ultimately essentially it was like this fairly what sounds like a simple problem of merging these big lists of people together into a single hopefully non-redundant list of people and then be able to print out a list of electors from that. The kind of cool thing there was that Elections Canada was pretty proactive in being an advocate for democracy worldwide, and they actually took the idea of this system to other nascent democracies around the world over time, and were recognized for that. I know in the late 90s, anyway. So the point is just that those were kind of two interesting and what I felt like were rewarding projects to be on. So that was kind of nice.
Well, after you left that first job, what other companies have you worked for?
So I left from there. So I worked for Synetics. They were actually bought by a very large company called SAIC, which was a big government contracting company. When I left there, I went to a pretty small consulting company called Cambridge Technology Partners, which when I joined them, their kind of major selling point was they were the self-proclaimed inventors of fixed price, fixed time consulting work. So I spent a few years there. It was in that job that I found my way into a knowledge management related position. I continue to do client facing work for Cambridge Technology Partners, but around 2000 met a colleague actually of both of ours, Ray Sims, and he was given the task of updating the software for the knowledge management system that Cambridge Technology Partners was using because they were on a pretty old version of some software that was at risk due to the dreaded Y2K bug. And so I got involved with I guess, upgrading and updating that. And that led me into a persistent role in the technology of um, knowledge management. And now, 25 years later, I kind of think of myself as in a position that rides the line between a technical development team and a knowledge management team. And just varying roles in that kind of vein since then. So that was a rewarding task. Um, Cambridge Technology Partners, a year or two after that, were bought by Novell, which is a software company. They were well known for having been I think, the first to implement networking software for PCs. And in the mid 90s, they really had a gangbuster few years because the internet kind of exploded at that point, and having some standard networking capabilities on PCs became kind of a default assumption. So they bought Cambridge Technology Partners because they had always been a software company, and apparently they wanted to get more into services, and that's how they saw that happening. And it was always kind of a bit of a challenging merger, I felt. I continued, though, in the knowledge management role. The knowledge management organization was eventually folded into their learning and development organization. And then, if sometime late in my career at Novell, um, I was moved over officially into the IT organization and probably spent my last year technically in that role. And then left there, came to Deloitte in early 2009 again, because in fact, I think I got a message from both you and Ray Sims virtually on the same day about this position that had opened up, and ended up having a series of interviews and then eventually coming to Deloitte in early 2009, and I've been there since.
What's a hobby or interest that you enjoy?
Two things that I can think of. The big one, and I think the thing that most people associate me with, is I'm a pretty active runner. Even as I'm creeping up on 60, I continue to run probably in the range of about 60 to 65 miles a week, running every day. Um, that would definitely be a big hobby of mine, and so a lot of my day revolves around finding time to do that. And the other big thing, though, is I am also very much a video slash PC game player. I've always been drawn to that since my very early interactions with computers. In fact, the TI 99 4A that I mentioned earlier that I taught myself to program on, some of the first programs I ever wrote myself were little video games, sort of in the vein of I can't even remember what it was called. There was a 2D based system. I guess it was vaguely similar to a Pac-Man type of thing. So I wrote something like that. The fun thing about working on that computer was my friend who had it did not have any storage capability at all. And so every time we wanted to run a program, we'd literally have to type the whole thing in. I remember the day he got a cassette tape recorder, which was capable of being written to by the computer, we celebrated because we finally did not have to type the programs in every time we wanted to run them. Um, so yeah, and ever since, and I've always been very much a video game player, I guess. Also enjoy reading, although a lot in the last few years I've converted into much more of an audiobook listener than an active reader. But that's because it kind of goes hand in hand actually with being an active runner. I have a lot of time to listen to things when I'm not really mentally occupied otherwise. So
Well, I know of at least one other interest of yours, which is trivia.
That is true. I always enjoyed a good trivia, actually. I first bumped into Trivial Pursuit when I was at the University of Michigan, which I think is roughly probably for the year it really exploded on the world was about 1984 or so, somewhere around there, which would have been my freshman year, and had a lot of fun. And about 6, 7, 8 years ago, something like that, friends of ours at a local pub started up a trivia night, and they asked if my wife and I, who also is very much a trivia person, if we wanted to join their team, and we joined, and we are still working with them, are still playing with them. Although the exact participants have changed a bit over the years, but we're still there. Our trivia team name unofficially is the Cocky Bastards because we inevitably always bet the maximum on our final question, which is the most points that we can put into a question. And it's like we always think of it as we're like we don't do it because we're smart. We just do it because we're cocky, and we feel like, well, if we don't get it right, then we might as well not win anyway. So
And so you've had some success with that team.
yes, we have over the years, at least locally, we the trivia is put on by a company that hosts as kind of has a regular season. I think it's twice a year they will have like regional championships, and we've managed to quote unquote win the local standings in our pub probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 times over the years, maybe more than that. But we've gone to the regional championships where we then learn just how humbled we can be by other people, but also the nature of the questions seem to change a bit and they become quite a bit tougher. So, but
Well, you mentioned that you like to read. What do you like to read?
I grew up um, actually in high school. I'll start with my high school year. So in
Okay.
high school, I bumped into the Lord of the Rings, and all I can say it was a life-changing experience, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but really took to those books. I read all of those books. I read the Silmarillion. I read Unfinished Tales, a whole lot of other stuff by Tolkien. The fantasy genre really struck me. And I still am an ardent reader and now listener to fantasy. I also enjoy science fiction. Um, I do read some nonfiction, but it tends not, I'm not really that interested in history. So it tends to be things like I just actually put a book on the shelf called Math with Bad Drawings, which was an exploration of various aspects of mathematics. But the author likes to put in these like little stick figure drawings. So that was a fun read. And I also read a book called Fermat's Last Theorem, which was a history, I guess, of the attempts to solve or to prove Fermat's last theorem. And Andrew Weir, I think it was, who was the mathematician who years ago finally was able to put together a really complex sequence of proofs that led to the proving that. So it was always that vein of nonfiction is definitely much more my wheelhouse than anything like history.
Yeah, that last one I also read and loved, and I guess that qualifies as math geeks.
Indeed,
Do you have
indeed.
a favorite author or a favorite book?
Um, well, author, I would actually just say Tolkien.
Hmm.
That's an easy answer.
Yeah.
Other authors that I have very much enjoyed, I liked the Robert Jordan Wheel of Time series. He was very wordy, but I enjoyed those books. And lately, Brandon Sanderson, another fantasy author, is one that I enjoy reading. I am listening to, I think it's the fifth in his Stormlight Archives books, which is still, I don't know how long it is as a physical book, but it's a 62-hour audio book, which is, I mean, that must be 1,500 pages maybe. So it is a very long, long book. But so I would say Brandon Sanderson is the more recent author that I probably appreciate most.
Okay. Now, t turning to food, I know you're a particular eater. What do you like to eat?
Um, so the first dumb joke I would make is that what I like to eat is a lot. And that's because again, I've always been a pretty active runner, so I always find that in fact, sometimes I tell myself I actually run in order to eat a lot, so it's like a self-fulfilling cycle. But
Hmm.
as for kinds of foods, I like Italian quite a lot. I like Mexican food. Um, a particular type, I would have to say, pizza is probably right at the top of my list, especially um, Detroit style. I would say, like for anybody who knows cottage in as a style. or some Chicago deep dish. Sometimes though, that even though I appreciate a good crusty pizza, sometimes I do find the Chicago style just a little bit too much. But Uno's always like was a good moderate version of the Chicago deep dish. So those would be probably my two favorite types of food, Italian and Mexican. I do like good Chinese food, um, pasta in general. So would
Now
probably be it.
we've had a number of meals together, but if we were to go out together, where would you take me if we were eating out?
I would. So I know you're a foodie. So I don't know if there's any place I could pick that you wouldn't say, "Oh, that sounds interesting." But in the area that we are in, I would probably say someplace that serves like a good pulled pork. Like maybe like Slows in downtown Detroit would be good.
Hmm.
My wife makes a really, to me anyway, a very good homemade pulled pork. She also does a very good um, barbecue sauce. So we will commonly have barbecue chicken. So if I were to invite you over, it would probably be one of those kinds of things. Maybe put something on the grill or just have her. She makes it in the oven, makes the barbecue chicken in the oven quite often when it's like too cold or whatever. But something like that
Okay.
would be my.
So if we were going to go out eat in Marshall, where would we go?
If we were to go out and eat in Marshall. Now it's been years since I've actually gone any place specific. I guess the iconic place in Marshall would be Windschuler Pub.
Right.
So anybody who's driven past Marshall on the highway, I'm sure has seen signs for Windschuler. Um, there was a place actually now I think it's a chain now, but there was a place when I was in high school that sold sub sandwiches, Mancino's, that I really enjoyed their sandwiches. So maybe there too, one of those two places.
Okay. I know that you like music. What's a favorite song or group that you have?
So so I guess a couple of things. In my college years, actually, this was even in my high school years, I really took to like synth pop type style music. The first big act that really I was a big fan of was Eurythmics. Their album, I think it was Sweet Dreams, was their first big album. Um, I really appreciated the sound. I think I've bought basically all of their albums. I also have always been a fan, actually, of there's a musician, Vince Clarke, who was originally part of Depeche Mode. He broke out or left Depeche Mode, started a group called in the UK, I think they were called Yazoo, but in the US they were always called Yaz, with a female singer, Alison Moyet. They only made a couple albums, but I really like both of their albums. And then he left there and formed a group called Erasure. And I think for my Spotify Unwrapped for 2025, I was in the 0.07% of top listeners of Erasure. And so apparently I'm a big Vince Clarke fan. The other kinds of things that growing up were very impactful on me, I guess, would have been actually my mother listened to country music. I have never liked country music, but I do have a weak spot for some of the classic country music like Patsy Cline and Johnny
Hmm.
Cash.
Hmm.
But another album that I feel like was kind of really impactful on my growing up years was Rumors by Fleetwood Mac. I
Hmm.
still very much enjoy that. It would probably easily still be in my top five albums, even though it's almost 50 years old now. So definitely th that's kind of my style. I listen to a lot of genres. Um, I also in the I guess in the late 80s, early 90s grew to like hip hop and rap quite a bit. So I do listen to quite a bit of that style. Um, in my, let's say the last 15 years, I've actually oddly become a fan of Led Zeppelin. I never really appreciated their sound, but I do appreciate what they do, even slightly heavier stuff like AC/DC. Not so much a fan of like the really intense stuff, but then in the last few years, my daughter has kind of done a good job keeping me on more in touch with recent stuff. So I have become a fan of Olivia Rodrigo, who's a pop singer, and
Hmm.
just in the last year and a half, Chappell Roan, who's also a pop singer.
Hmm.
So they both of them over the last few years have taken up several spots in my top songs on Spotify, honestly. So that's I guess kind of a quick overview there.
What was the first record that you bought?
The very The first one I can remember buying was Synchronicity by the Police as an
Mhm.
album.
Yeah.
Um, in the first CD I ever bought was Touch by Eurythmics, which is their second major album. They had a first album that I didn't mention. I think it was called In the Garden, which was followed by Sweet Dreams, which was followed by Touch. The first record that I ever owned was a gift that I got in like fifth grade, which was the A-B combination from Queen of We Are the Champions and it was the B-side. Yeah, the Champions, and it's the other famous song from that era by Queen.
We will rock you.
That's it. We Will Rock You. Yes, and I remember getting that as like it was like a fifth grade Christmas gift exchange, and I was very excited to actually own my own record for a change.
Was that a 45?
It was a 45,
Okay. So
indeed.
you weren't too young for 45s.
I was not.
Okay.
I probably owned more 45s that I'm forgetting, but
Okay. Great. What was the last concert you attended?
probably so the last actual real concert would have probably been They Might Be Giants, which I took my wife to in 2019, I think it was, at St. Andrews Hall in downtown Detroit. In recent years, we've taken to going to see musicals. So technically it's not a concert, but we
Mhm.
last summer we saw the show Six in Chicago, which is basically a concert. It's just a series of song performances. There's not really much of a story to it beyond what's told through the songs. We've seen a lot of musicals this year. We actually ended up buying season tickets. So I never thought I would be, but I have apparently now become a theater person.
Oh,
So
interesting.
that's been fun.
What sports do you enjoy watching?
Uh, two sports that I enjoy watching most would be track and field still, and soccer or football for international people. I've always appreciated soccer. Grew up playing it only in gym class. My hometown did not have any opportunities to play soccer. It's like I always felt like I wanted to. Um, later in life, about just after I turned 40, I took up playing indoor soccer for years, but because I never played as a young man, I was never very good. But I just enjoy watching it. I did enjoy my time playing it. So soccer and track. Um, I do not enjoy really any of the major U.S. sports, other than I do like to watch Michigan football. That's the one thing that still kind of holds out. Um, in But I don't watch any Major League Baseball or NFL football, NBA or NHL. Just none of them really draw my attention at all, honestly.
Do you have a favorite athlete or a favorite team?
Favorite athlete would probably be Eliud Kipchoge, who is a marathoner. I followed his career since probably the last 15 years. He was big on the track and then transitioned to the marathon and was world dominant for many years, broke the world record a couple of times. Was the first man under 2 hours, although in a fairly contrived scenario, but he was the first man to run under 2 hours in the marathon. So, Eliud Kipchoge definitely would be one. Interestingly, Usain Bolt, I always liked him as well. He was very fast, obviously, and just a real um, standout. I felt like, and just as a person as well.
And is your favorite team the University of Michigan?
Favorite team, sure.
Okay.
Favorite soccer team, I would have to, that would be tough, but I'd have to say Manchester United. I enjoy a lot of mostly English soccer. I enjoy the
Mhm.
style of English soccer more than most other league soccers, and among the English teams, Manchester United.
Do you have a favorite sports memory?
Favorite sports memory. Personally, as I mentioned, I've been an active runner for a while. I have done many road races over the years. And in 2015, I ran a half marathon and set a new personal best, which that probably among my own personal memories it would be a real peak for me. The following year, I tried to do the full and I finished the full, but did not achieve my goals in that particular race. So I wouldn't, I mean, it was a good challenging thing, but I would not hold that out
Okay.
as a particularly awesome personal memory.
You've also tried triathlon, have you not?
I have, yes, indeed. When I joined Deloitte, the my manager was she would do triathlons, and she knew I was a pretty active runner. And for many years, early in my career at Deloitte, she would just sort of egg me on and say, "You really need to try a triathlon. You really need to try a triathlon." And I've never been a swimmer, which was the big weakness I always felt I had. My two kids, as they grew up, they were both real standout swimmers. And finally, one time in January, would have been around, what, 2014, my daughter was still in high school. I finally said, okay, I'm going to try this, give this triathlon thing a try. But in order to even figure out if I want to do it, I wanted to go to the local pool. So I made my daughter come along with me. She had just finished one of her high school seasons. And I said, Katie, can you come kind of show me the ropes? And her training was basically she got in the water and said, "Now you do this," and she swam away. What I learned is she's not a particularly good teacher of swimming. Not her fault, but I started swimming then, and I still swim to this day. And then along the way, I have done a half dozen triathlons. In 2020, I actually had all of the triathlons I've done have been sprint distance, which are the kind of short versions. In 2020, I had set my mind on doing a half Ironman, which is a 1.2 mile swim, 56-mile bike ride, and a half marathon run. And I knew that would be tough, but I felt like I could do it as long as I could get through the swim. And so I'd made progress. I was swimming probably every time I would go, I'd put in like a mile and a half or so in the pool. But of course, in March of 2020, along came the pandemic, and there were no races at all in 2020. And then for a few years after that, there weren't any local races. And in the intervening years, as I've gotten older, I've just lost a step, and actually even in my running, and I've not gotten back to doing triathlons since then. So maybe someday, though.
Our last topic is humor. Do you have a favorite comedian or comedy film or TV show?
Favorite comedian, probably. So kind of combining things here. Seinfeld, I think, is an easy answer as far as
Mhm.
both a comedian and a TV show.
Yeah.
Another TV show that I thought was well beyond what it was recognized for was Arrested Development, I think in the early 2000s. Just the sense of humor in that show really always struck me. So comedy film, let me think about that one. Maybe, I mean, of course, I grew up in the 70s, and so I kind of want to say something stupid like Animal House or Caddyshack, one in that vein. Those are very culturally inappropriate, I'm sure in hindsight, but those really were funny. Blazing Saddles, also same vein. Young Frankenstein. Those all would definitely
Okay.
be uh, in my top list. Top list,
Okay.
though.
Who's the best at making you laugh?
This one's an easy one. My wife. And I also think that of the people I know, I try to be humorous actually throughout my life, but I feel like my wife is also the easiest one for me to get to laugh. So she
Okay.
wins both of those.
All right. That's good. All right. It's time for a story. What story would you like to share with us?
All right. So I let me share a story about how I met my wife actually. Um, Starts way back in college. She and we realized in hindsight we were in circles of friends that had more overlaps than we knew at the time, and we probably met at college parties several times through our college careers. I had a friend who eventually became a roommate who was dating one of her roommates, and so I'm sure that we must have met at different times. In the last year of my graduate career, though, because we were young and stupid, we decided it would be a good idea to throw a toga party of all things. And that was the first time I remember meeting her. She came with a friend of hers, and we, of course, also, again, being young and stupid, we had a limbo contest in the middle of our toga party, and she was one of the people holding the limbo stick. And whenever it was her friend's turn to go under, she would carefully raise the stick, and then everybody else she would lower back down, and nobody was really paying close enough attention to realize this was going on. Um, After that, we Um, Ended up my same roommate. He was then formally a roommate, not just my friend, but he was back. He had worked for a little while after we had both graduated from undergraduate. He had worked for a while out in San Francisco and moved back to Ann Arbor and moved into the apartment with me. And then one day he and I were just going to walk down to one of the local pubs in Ann Arbor, and he said, "Well, let's stop by and see if Suzanne's around," because he was a friend of hers. He knew her from having been around her when he was dating her roommate, and that was really the first time that I remember um, meeting her for real. And we got to know each other a bit there, and that was probably, I don't know, a month before she was going to graduate with her bachelor's. I was going to graduate with my master's. We had our first date the Tuesday after we both graduated. We went to Middle Kingdom, I think was the restaurant in Ann Arbor at the time. I'm not sure if it's still there. That was our first official date. And we then got married. I'm going to jump forward a bit. We got married in about 2 years later. She ended up, after she graduated, she lived in Grand Rapids for about a year and a half. While I worked at that Synetics company, I was living out of Ann Arbor, and then I moved to Farmington Hills while I worked for that Synetics company in West Bloomfield. We had a long distance relationship. We got engaged though in about a little over a year after we started dating. Got married a little less than 2 years after we started dating, and then that was right. It was right after that, shortly after that, that we moved out to Massachusetts. Um, so I would say she it was like a lucky last minute occurrence that we ended up meeting each other at the time that we did, because had we not, things could have turned out very differently for both of us. So I'm very happy that we did meet. We are still, she's my best friend still. Um, the other thing, I guess, to kind of tie in a little, so after that, to tie in a little bit of another question that I know was on the list here is a holiday story. This is not a great holiday story, but after we started dating and I had graduated with my master's, I ended up buying my very first car, which was a Toyota Tercel, and I could not drive a stick shift at all. And that was much cheaper kind of car to buy at the time. And so we'd been dating for about a month, and I made her come along with me, and she did all the test driving for me. And then after I decided to buy the car, um, she taught me how to drive a stick shift. Then 6 months later, in December of 1990, I was at her mother's house over the Christmas holiday period, and my car was parked in front of her mother's house and was hit from behind by somebody driving down the street and pushed into a telephone pole. So I spent 3 months driving a rental while they fixed up my little Toyota Tercel. Um, and that Christmas period, I ended up going. She was still in Grand Rapids at that point, and she had to drive from her mother's house up to Grand Rapids. And there was a huge snowstorm, and I was driving from my mother's house to Grand Rapids on the day after Christmas. And I was in the part of Michigan that was much icier than it was snowy. And I remember that drive was a terrifying experience of feeling like every time I moved the steering wheel, the car was sliding a little bit this way or that way. So that was kind of an intense holiday period for us, that's for sure. But
So, so when you met, what was the thing that you kind of hit it off on? What was your connection based on?
honestly, I would say humor. I've always found her very funny. She's also very smart. I've always appreciated that about her. Um, she's a very strong-willed woman, which I appreciate as well. I feel like that was something that I learned from my mother is that attitude. So I would say that was the primary thing.
And how long have you been married now?
It'll be 34 years in March.
Oh, great.
So good long
Great.
time.
All right, well, I'm going to wrap up with a couple little stories about our time together, starting with a time that you and I were in Philadelphia. We used to have to go to meetings for Deloitte that were in Glen Mills, Pennsylvania, outside Philly, and we were heading back to Detroit, and we found out, I think, on the way to the airport that the flight was going to be delayed. And I said, well, this is an opportunity. I think there's this place my friend Steve Carter has told me about called Tony Luke's. That's a cheesesteak place, and we,
Yep.
we ought to go there. And you agreed, so we just kept going past the airport, found the Tony Luke's that was located underneath the freeway, and I think you got a cheesesteak and I got a pork sandwich, roast pork sandwich, and I thought, oh, this is great. This was when I really was my introduction to Philadelphia sandwiches, but you were willing to go along with me. And then later on,
Yep.
I think we had some other cheesesteak related adventures at meetings that were held, including one time when we hired a taxi to take us to Tony Luke's. And Adrian Eusta, who was the guy who arranged the taxi, decided to buy a cheesesteak for the taxi driver so he would come back and get us.
I'd
Gave us
forgotten
the,
that part.
yeah. Now, the
We're
other
cheese
part of food is
we are
when I mentioned that you
cheesesteak
were,
friendly. We are cheesesteak heavy friends, actually.
right, right. Um, Now, subsequently, I recall asking you one time if you'd be willing to join me at an Indian restaurant, and you said, no, no, you don't like Indian food. And I said, well, there's a lot of different kinds of Indian food. Sometimes people are quick to dismiss Indian food and they'll say they don't like curry, and there's other kinds. So I said, would you at least meet me at an Indian restaurant and at least like look it over before you reject it? And you reluctantly agreed. So we met at an Indian restaurant in Farmington Hills that had a buffet. And I got you to kind of walk the line and you kind of looked and smelled it and you said, no, no, I don't care. I don't care for any of this stuff.
That
So
that
we
is
ended up going to a Thai restaurant, I think.
that remains true. And I've actually for work traveled to India 5 times, which of course makes for interesting dining experiences.
So what do you do when you're in India? Do they try to give you Indian food and you resist?
So what I actually do is I will eat mostly I would say American style or Western foods like at the hotel or go out to a restaurant. One of the strategies that I use is I tend to eat the workday starts later in India than it does for me here in the US. And so I would tend to eat like a larger breakfast. So I'm not like hungry through the course of the workday and then eat at dinner. But um, it is true every time I visit, the team really does want me to join them for lunch when they go for lunch. So occasionally I will join them, but I usually still I'll just sit and chat with them instead of eating lunch. But yeah, so I don't know. I feel like this is probably self-satisfying, but I feel like having grown up in kind of a relatively poor Midwestern American with that kind of as my background, I never had the opportunity to grow to appreciate the Indian cuisine much, is what it comes down to. And that's probably just a failing of mine.
Well, maybe one of these days I'll get you to try something. Maybe I'll bring it along secretly and label it as something else. And after you eat it and like it, I'll say, aha, that
Well,
was Indian food.
I've discovered biryani, I think. Is that
Oh, okay.
biryani?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I've
biryani.
had that a few times, and actually that vein I think is good.
Oh, okay.
It
So
can,
you've
especially in Hyderabad, can be quite spicy, which is one of the other factors I always have to think about is I'm not really a fan of
okay.
spicy food.
So maybe we can go out for biryani at some time.
Sure,
Okay,
sure.
good, good. I'm glad to hear it. Well, Lee, thanks a lot for spending time with me today. Enjoyed talking with you. We've enjoyed being your colleague all these years and look forward to seeing you again soon.
All right. Thank you, Stan.